At 85, Diana Ross finally opens up about Motown. You would never know what Diana just let slip about Motown. After decades of being coached for interviews, she finally let something heavy slip. Something about the record label that made and broke some of the toughest artists the world has ever seen. For many years, Diana Ross was the picture of perfection. She was the dream girl with the golden voice, the shining star that Berry Gordy pushed to the center of the stage and dared the world not to love. But behind those pretty dresses was a world most people never saw. A world Diana has remained quiet about for more than half a century, until now. It was a careless slip, but those of us who understand the history, those of us who know the shadows that lingered behind Motown's brilliance, know exactly what she meant. Motown was a machine built on order and a sterling image. Berry Gordy made sure of that. He made sure his artists rehearsed every stage performance and even every interview. So, most of their worst scandals were neatly resolved before they could reach the public. Diana Ross knew better than anyone what it meant to not play along. She was the face of the label, the one who couldn't afford to crack. But everything must have haunted her so much that even decades later, it still sits heavily on the tips of her tongue. Fortunately, Diana has always known how to protect herself. The young girl from Detroit's Brewster Douglas projects didn't rise to superstardom by being naive. She watched and studied every single move of her boss and found a way to shield herself from the chaos until she couldn't anymore. Motown is a record label founded by Berry Gordy in Detroit, which was nicknamed Motortown. Motown became a legendary label known for breaking down racial barriers in music. They signed black artists and still managed to achieve widespread success with white audiences. If you want to know how successful they were, then look at the artists they built: Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, the Jackson 5, etc. Berry Gordy was good. But that was until he turned very rouge, and all artists began running away from him, one after the other. Some of them granted extensive interviews, but only Diana Ross struggled to keep her cool. Even now, she doesn't say everything. She can't, but she says just enough. Enough to make you wonder what really went on behind Motown's glossy curtain. Enough to remind you that Diana Ross, the legend, was once a young woman trapped in the very system she helped build. Something in Diana's childhood must have kept her from talking. It might look like shyness, but it isn't. Diana was the second of 6 children to Ernestine, née Moten, and Fred Ross Sr., so she was anything but shy. She was born on March 26, 1944, in Detroit's North End, and grew up in a neighborhood that loved music so much that there were a lot of church choirs, music radios, etc. Unfortunately, she did not have a peaceful childhood. Her mother became so ill with tuberculosis that the family had to send the children away to Alabama to stay with some relatives. It was disruptions like this that taught her and her siblings stoicism and made her into the woman she would grow to become, the woman who measured her words against the consequences. By her teens, Diana had moved with her family into the Brewster Douglas housing projects, the same block where Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson were raised. She attended Cass Technical High School, where she took sewing, fashion design, millinery, and pattern-making classes. She also took evening modeling and cosmetology lessons. Many don't know, but Smokey Robinson did loan her money for these classes. She did so many things before actively pursuing music. She even worked small jobs to help her family. She worked at Hudson's downtown Detroit store and even offered hairdressing services to neighbors. In the process, she also learned financial discipline. Her music career began with a small group, the Primettes. They were, first, a neighborhood sister act, and they sang in church basements, on stoops, and at school functions, any place that offered a microphone or the hope of one. They worked so hard to be successful and did not even get to enjoy any overnight miracle. They suffered through rehearsals and rejections, but kept showing up. One of the places they kept showing up at was Hitsville. Sometimes they would simply stand at the doorway until someone let them in. What was Hitsville? Hitsville was a narrow house on West Grand Boulevard, everyone called Studio A. It was a converted photography studio with wood floors and a control room that smelled of cigarette smoke. Berry Gordy owned Hitsville. He had bought the unassuming house and built something that the world would respect for decades. It was in this tiny room that the biggest records were born. The room is now a museum that preserves its peeling paint and the original mixing board, but it preserves its hidden stories even more. It was this room that the girls hounded day and night. Well, at last, it paid off. Berry Gordy signed them to Motown in the early 1960s. He liked them so much that he helped them promote their best songs. Yes, it was the Primettes that later became the Supremes. At Motown, there was an apprentice service. For example, Motown's famous finishing school under Maxine Powell taught the girls posture, elocution, greeting, the choreography of entrance and exit, etc. For a girl who had learned financial discipline at home, finishing school made Diana look more the part. Still at the studio, Cholly Atkins taught her choreography so well that she looked like she had always been on stage. But many of the other artists complained that they felt heavily edited into a persona that was too clinical. If the girls felt that way, it was not obvious from the jump. They recorded a lot of tracks to impress the label, but they all flopped. But they didn't stop. At last, in April 1964, Where Did Our Love Go became their first #1 hit. And just like that, the group began to rise very quickly. And of course, the pressures rose too. To be the face of Motown meant walking a narrow plank where every misstep would be amplified. But the problem was, these pretty girls were not even being paid enough. Royalties on record sales amounted to 2.7%, which was little more than small change once it was divided up between the group members. And Motown preferred to keep it as a deposit to cover tax and other contingencies. Sometimes Motown would keep the money and arrange for a small weekly salary, which for much of the 1960s was between $10 and $20. But Diana said nothing. Her silence seemed to have been rooted in her early hardship. After many years of holding a household together while her parents were ill or occupied, she had learned to shoulder pain quietly, and her experiences during that trying period made her cautious about sharing her personal wounds. Other artists were different. Marvin Gaye had quite a popular clash with Gordy because he wanted to make socially conscious music, which nearly derailed the release of What's Going On. Stevie Wonder fought for ownership of his own songs. Even Smokey Robinson, Gordy's closest friend, grew tired of his friend's system. But in the middle of all this turmoil was Diana. She was the only star who never seemed to complain. While Gaye, Wonder, and others were at war with Gordy, Diana seemed to thrive inside his kingdom. Well, Diana knew something else they didn't. She had learned early that certain names carried a lot of power. Crossing them meant ruining your career. Questioning them was just as bad too, so the only thing she could do was show up every day and work. The only thing she could do was build herself into an irreplaceable artist. She learned how to make a high tune hang so long and to be the reigning voice on every track. Those who watched her closely, band members, choreographers, and the label's development teachers, saw a young woman who was quite ambitious. She became a triple threat that was untouchable for years. She built alliances, allowed herself to be trained and retrained, and learned how to get the maximum artistic capital without chasing pity. She was smart enough to know that provoking the wrong person meant losing a song placement or even a TV slot. Knowing and respecting who controlled what, who wrote the songs, who created the choreography, who mixed the tracks, and who signed the checks helped her a lot. Berry Gordy was the visionary, but around him stood lieutenants. Smokey Robinson, who shaped the sound, the Funk Brothers, who powered the hits, and managers like Shelley Berger, who controlled the business. Diana navigated them all with precision. She infiltrated them and became Gordy's confidant, his muse, and in time, his obsession. Her colleagues noticed too. In fact, Cindy Birdsong, who replaced Florence Ballard, recalled, "You couldn't say no to Diana because Berry wouldn't say no to her." Ross didn't have to overstep these men, but she learned how to move within their shadows while quietly pulling strings. In fact, in an interview with the BBC, she said, "Motown was like a family, but in a family you have to know your place." So when she finally let that line slip, the casual, offhand reference to the deep funk that no one expected her to name, years later, it must have come from the little girl inside, dying to be heard. And she definitely has many things to let loose from her chest. Berry Gordy might be a strategic visionary in the morning, but he was merciless during off hours. Everyone he worked with remembered him as quite controlling. One night in Las Vegas at the Flamingo in the summer of 1967, one of his artists, Florence, arrived looking unfit. There are tales suggesting that she was drunk. Well, without thinking twice, the managers returned her to Detroit, and an understudy, Cindy Birdsong, appeared in her place. This is one scandal Barry couldn't sit on. Florence was shocked at how replaceable she was, but she was not the only one feeling the shock. Other artists became wary too. But Barry did not stop. He made every artist rehearse until muscle memory made all their smiles look effortless. He also made all the major decisions in quiet meetings without the knowledge of the artists. One of such was the decision to change the group's name from The Supreme to Diana Ross and the Supremes. Of course, none of the other girls smiled at the drastic change. In fact, it caused such a huge rift that the group began to suffer. It is the human edges of these stories that make it hard to tell. People in Motown's orbit speak about the label with affection and exasperation at the same time. They credit Gordy for teaching the artists. They praise the writers and the band who built the sound, then mourn the poor way the artists were paid. And it did not help that recording sessions often bled into the night. In fact, whenever a new song was written, Gordy would order it to be performed by different artists. Then, at the quality control meetings, they would decide which version would be released. But get this, the groups performing the discarded versions were still charged for the renting of the studio, musicians, and technicians. In fact, during the Jackson 5's 6 years at Motown, only 174 of the 469 songs they recorded were released. Yet when they wanted to sign with Epic, they were presented with a bill for the entire 469. Many of Motown's other dodgy practices were even more heartbreaking, like deducting a high percentage of copies from sales that were damaged during distribution. Even as an African American too, and a songwriter himself, Gordy became even more ruthless than the white-owned record labels. His artists lived on gigs and extensive touring and earned minimal royalties. If they even needed to buy cars, they had to borrow money from Motown and were charged interest. By 1968, many of the artists ran away from the label. In short, Berry Gordy single-handedly built and killed one of the world's most famous music factories. This is where Diana really began to suffer. Her strong financial discipline and strong social skills might have kept her afloat even with such a boss, but she was still suffering like the others. Yet they seemed to dislike her too. Why? She was the poster girl of the label, the one who seemed to enjoy favoritism. Even Marvin Gaye, Motown's prince, once said, "Diana wanted it all, and Barry gave it to her." Engineers and historians have even pointed to instances where a mix would favor one voice and pull another back, by choice. Imagine your manager dialing your harmony down on a record, or imagine realizing your part was re-recorded by another voice, and all the hours you spent in the studio were useless. It was not Diana's fault that Gordy was doing this, but she inherited all the hate. In fact, in one of her interviews recently, she let slip that Gordy's control over Motown was very detrimental to the careers of many artists. She even suggested that Gordy should have allowed for more creative freedom. According to her, his strictness was why the label declined. She had to endure people who thought their ambitions collided with hers, bandmates, managers, superstar producers, and even her founder. The list of her ops, those who stood directly or indirectly against her, kept growing. Still, there are so many things we might never fully understand. The most obvious one was Florence Ballard. Florence had such a strong voice that it could shatter the silence in a room. But then she was removed from the label. Immediately after she was kicked out, Motown's billing shifted to Diana Ross and the Supremes. The change looked like a marketing decision, and it would have stayed that way if Florence hadn't suddenly died in 1976 at just 32. It was even later revealed that Florence had signed a contract after she was removed to continue representing her label well in public, which was an obvious attempt to control the narrative. Motown's capacity to make those decisions in private, then present a rosy public image, made the artists feel boxed and caged in, unable to speak. But some did not stay bound for long. One of them was Mary Wilson, who wrote about the small, accumulating injuries she suffered while working with the label. She mentioned missed rehearsals, slights, and the growing realization that the label favored one face, In all her memoirs and interviews, she spoke honestly about the sting of seeing the favoritism and realizing she was more or less a prop. In fact, she said, "There is a certain thing about Diana, she wants everything herself." Then there were the writers and producers. Holland Dozier Holland, for example, was the trio who built many of Motown's greatest hits. The Supreme became hitmakers with their melodies and hooks, but in the late 1960s, they quit. They walked away from Motown over royalties and profit-sharing disputes. That sudden loss totally ruined the group's sound. If Diana felt pity for the other artists, she didn't show it. She quickly aligned herself with Gordy in ways others in the group couldn't or wouldn't. In fact, the relationship between Ross and Gordy went beyond business. And though Gordy downplayed it publicly, Diana herself admitted later that Gordy was the love of my life. That closeness gave her an unshakable advantage, and she wielded it mercilessly. So by 1967, Gordy officially renamed the group Diana Ross and the Supremes. Wilson recalled the moment in her memoir, Dream Girl. "It was like the rest of us didn't exist anymore. Diana didn't fight it. She wanted it." Diana worked hard still and even enjoyed a romantic relationship with Gordy, and their relationship produced a daughter, Rhonda. At that point, it was hard to convince anyone that the decision to prioritize her was merely strategic. The favoritism was quite obvious, and all artists could smell the coffee. But Diana, even with her hands tied, did try to push back too. She pursued solo projects, took film roles that required her to be the main character, and negotiated deals to secure financial autonomy for herself. Then in 1981, she signed a headline contract beyond Motown, which was her way of saying she no longer desired to be entirely controlled by their schedules and strategies. But Diana Ross did not vanish after Motown. She reinvented herself. It was as if she knew she could never fully leave the world that had made her, but she could reinvent herself on her own terms. She had been the lead voice of the Supremes, the crowned jewel of Berry Gordy's empire, yet stepping away from Motown meant rewriting the script of who Diana Ross was. And she did it so well. Gone was the young Detroit girl molded into the perfect Motown star. She became more elegant and more of a diva. She was now less Berry Gordy's protege and more a global icon. Then she took on the role of Billie Holiday and was nominated for an Academy Award. She played that role so well that she stunned critics who had dismissed her as just another Gordy creation. With Billie, Diana proved she could show pain, vulnerability, and artistry in ways Motown never let her show. So that role became a career milestone and a pivot point. But it wasn't only in film. Musically, Diana began experimenting with sounds that stretched beyond the Motown formula. While her Diana album in 1980, produced with Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards of Chic, carried a disco side to it, it also showed how determined she was to remain relevant in a changing industry. Her other tracks, Upside Down and I'm Coming Out, were hits and statements. The former playfully flipped gender roles and expectations, while the latter became a queer anthem whose meaning Diana herself didn't fully grasp at the time. Still, it proved that she was an artist who could adapt, even thrive, when the rules of the industry changed. Even her interviews changed. She went from being quite soft-spoken to being sharper and unapologetic. Many people noted this change and even accused her of becoming too cold and difficult. But that wasn't true. Diana was just shielding herself. She was creating a persona away from the one Berry Gordy and Motown executives had built for her. She was done allowing people to decide who and what she should be. For decades, Diana Ross has carefully managed her image. She has smiled through rumors, ignored accusations, and spoken only in fragments. But as the years pass, the truth grows harder to hide. Now, as she finally begins to open up about Motown, we keep wondering what she will admit. Will she acknowledge the favors she leveraged, the silences she maintained?